So I'm going to be quick. I'm going to introduce our two co-authors today. First of all, the key thing I want to get across is to have Morton Kondracke and Fred Barnes, who have such esteemed long careers in Washington and all sorts of things, New Republic and so on, choose Jack Kemp as a subject for a serious biography is a statement in and of itself. Jack Kemp was a remarkable figure, and given the events of recent lineage, including today, one has to wonder what he would be thinking about the sort of things that are going on these days. One other thing I want to mention briefly is that over there, we have some things that we requested and received from the Hoover Archives. There's a large collection of different memorabilia. Some of them relate to Kemp that are there. I invite you, when this is over, to take a look at it if you haven't already done so. So quickly, Morton Kondracke, for 20 years he was executive editor and a columnist for Roll Call, and he remains connected to the to Roll Call today as a contributing editor. He was a senior editor for the New Republic, Washington bureau chief for Newsweek, and a columnist for the Wall Street Journal, regular commentator on Fox News, and along with Fred Barnes, they were co-hosts of the Beltway Boys. And if you put your hand up when you say you remember it, you're going to show your age. It's has been around for a little while, but it's a great show, very vivacious and intriguing. He's also the author of Saving Millie, Love, Politics, and Parkinson's Disease, published in 2001, which was a bestseller, both New York Times and Washington Post. He conducted the Kemp Oral History Project, and he held the Jack Kemp Chair in Political Economy at the John W. Kluge Center, the Library of Congress. Fred Barnes appears regularly on Fox's Special Report with Bret Baier. I'm sure you've all seen that many times. And he was a regular panelist for a number of years on the McLaughlin Group. Also the author of Rebel in Chief, a terrific book, I think, published in 2006 about President George W. Bush. And the one thing I'll just say about their time at the New Republic, which we were talking about earlier, is that when they were both involved heavily in the New Republic, and you had other people like Michael Kinsley, Charles Krauthammer, and others, there was a really nice, tight tension that came through in the writings of the New Republic, both in the authored articles, but also the editorials, reflected a diversity of thought that they fleshed out, they argued, sharpened each other's arguments, and usually it was a really good place to come to learn a lot about issues. And so they're taking all those talents and they combined them in this book, which I haven't read the entire book, but it is a terrific read and I can't wait to finish it. So please join me in welcoming Morton Kondracke and Fred Barnes.
Okay. Thanks so much to Hoover. I'm so grateful for you to put this thing together. The person who got me into this whole thing to get the ball rolling is here, Jimmy Kemp, Jack's son, who is now the president of the Jack Kemp Foundation, and launched the Oral History Project. And I interviewed 100 football players and congressmen and staff members and family and so on. And then the Kemp Foundation endowed the Kemp Chair at the Library of Congress, where I was for 2 academic years, where Jack's papers are. So Jimmy is heavily responsible and is trying to keep the legacy alive with all kinds of programs that you should all know about. So we wrote this book for 4 reasons. The first one is that, as we say in the very first sentence in the book, that Jack Kemp was the most important politician of the 20th century who was not president, certainly the most influential Republican. And I'm going to let Fred explain why we said that, because that's his favorite part of the reasoning.
Downhill after the first sentence.
No, yeah. The fourth reason is the one that I care the most about, and that is that I think our country is in as deep trouble or deeper trouble now than it was in the 1970s, when stagflation and Soviet advances and deeply depressed morale in the country were rife. And Ronald Reagan, using Kemp Roth as the economic engine, turned all that around. So, but we're back in this situation where people are deeply unhappy, and we're we've got a world more complicated than the Cold War was. We've got economic stagnation, glacial growth, and we need the Kemp spirit, and we need some Kemp policies, which we can get into in order to bring us out. And unfortunately, I don't see a Jack Kemp on the horizon. Dennis Teddy, who's here, was a Jack Kemp speechwriter, and we decided together that there were three elements of Jack Kemp that nobody quite has: a combination of energy, love, and brains, wisdom. And I don't, you can. Some of them have some of them, but none of them has Jack. Is quite Jack, and we need Jack. Fred.
One of the great things about Jack Kemp is he often didn't need a speechwriter. And I'm not casting any aspersions on speechwriters, but his most famous speech was the one at the turn on this. Okay, you told me you'd yell at me. The most famous speech, or I think his best speech, was the one at the 1980 Republican convention in Detroit. And one of my favorite anecdote in the book is how that speech almost didn't happen, because Kemp was scheduled to speak, I forget which night it was, but after
Tuesday,
Tuesday, okay, the second night, after Barry Goldwater and before Henry Kissinger, and was going to speak in the 10 o'clock hour. Well, Barry Goldwater drones on and on and on. And finally, Mike Deaver, who was sort of in charge for the Reagan forces there, says, well, we're going to have to cut Kemp. He'll have to come on another night because we got to get Henry Kissinger on in prime time. And so he orders down to the floor to tell Kemp that he's not going to speak tonight, and they tell Kemp, and he accepts it, and he wanders out onto the floor of the convention. And the problem was somebody else didn't accept it. There was a congressman there from Delaware.
Tom Evans.
Yeah, Tommy Evans. Al, you'll remember him. Tommy Evans. He's my hero in this book. This is so great. Tommy Evans.
About Jack.
He's the guy who was standing there right by the woman who made the announcements and who did the introductions. And he says, "Introduce Kemp. Introduce Kemp. Do it. Do it." And she does it. And all of a sudden, Dave Smick, who worked for Kemp, is hearing. He all of a sudden hears, and he was a quarterback for the San Diego Chargers. And he says, "Wait a minute, they're introducing Kemp." He couldn't find him. Kemp had wandered out in the crowd, and finally goes out there, and because he sees his head of hair, and pulls him up to the podium, and Kemp is there, and he reads, and his speech. They have his speech still on the teleprompter. He gives the first two lines of his speech, and then wings it for his whole speech. Of course, it was the things he'd said before, but wings it and gives the speech of his career, and then there's a demonstration on the floor for him to be picked by Reagan as his running mate. Of course, he didn't do it, but it's just a great story. And think of that, Tommy Evans, what a great man, congressman from Delaware, telling Mike Deaver to shove it, and forcing Henry Kissinger to give his speech after prime time. I love that story. Kemp was, I knew Kemp pretty well, as some of you all did. Some of you all worked for him. Some of you all are sources for our book. Some of you were people like Al Hunt there, who he tried to convert over and over again. That was one of Kemp's great things. He really was an evangelist for tax cuts and supply side economics, and he wanted to convert everybody who wasn't a true believer. And along with him, the first trip I took with him was in 1981. I think it was before Reagan was sworn in. It was sometime in January, around the time Reagan was being sworn in, and I'd never met Kemp, even though he'd done all this stuff in the 1970s, and so it was arranged that I'd go on a trip with him up to Buffalo, and we flew up in a private plane, and he gave a few speeches, and then we came back, and I wound up writing a piece. But in any case, when I got on the plane, some of you all will have experienced this with Kemp. I thought, this is going to be it'll just be me and Jack Kemp, and I'll I'll get every question I want to ask. It'll be fantastic. Just be the two of us. He can't go and hide and talk to somebody else. And it turned out I got practically no questions in. He just talked the whole time, and he was trying to convert me. And after a while, he actually did a pretty good job, but was really a great evangelist. Here are two things I think that we say in the book that I think are important. And one is Kemp. Remember, Kemp was self-taught economics and a lot of other things. He majored in phys ed in college, and was self-taught in economics. And yet, really, won a great intellectual victory with his tax cut, first the Kemp Roth tax cut, and ultimately it became the Reagan tax cut. If you remember back in the 70s, all the Keynesian economists and the liberal economists didn't have a clue about what to do. And Jack Kemp and this supply side movement, which he had gathered around him, did have a clue, and they had an answer, and it was cutting the taxes, cutting income tax rates across the board by a large amount. Initially 30%, and then Reagan, after it was changed a little, to 25%. And the great thing about it was, it worked. It had great prosperity in the country in the 80s, into the 90s, and even into the 21st century. But it was a great intellectual triumph. Kemp read all these books that I find hard to read and didn't complete. I don't know whether any of you all have tried von Mises. Very hard, very difficult. It's not like reading a mystery novel, although it can sound like one sometimes. And Kemp read these things and really imbibed them. So it was a great intellectual triumph. And then some of you all know, some of you all were probably a part of the group that surrounded Kemp in the 70s. The economists who all hated each other and bickered and fought each other. That was one. He had the great support of the Wall Street Journal editorial page and the support of columnist Robert Novak. He also gathered around him all the smartest and most impressive of the young Republican congressmen, like Newt Gingrich, elected in 1978, and Connie Mack, and Dan Lundgren, and any number of other ones who are escaping my mind at the moment, Vin Weber. And so he had this crew there. And then there was Ronald Reagan. He had access to Ronald Reagan, had worked for him as an intern back when he played for the San Diego Chargers many years earlier. But anyway, had access to Ronald Reagan. Ronald Reagan, there's sort of a dispute between, and it's reflected in the book, where the one member of the Kemp entourage that went to meet with Reagan and his aides in January of 1980 and wanted to convert him to supply-side tax cuts. They call it, one of them, Lou Lehrman, called it a boarding party. Well, the Reagan people don't like to call it a boarding party, and they say, oh, come on, Reagan was always for cutting taxes and so on, which he was, no question about that. But a specific, and he had actually in 1978, correct me if I'm wrong, Mort, had endorsed the Kemp Roth tax cut. But it was unclear what he was going to do on taxes in the campaign, and was convinced by Kemp that it is this supply side across the board tax cut rates, not just targeted tax cuts here and there and so on. And Reagan was convinced that this would be the way to provide incentives and investment and savings and spur work, and it was I believe the right thing to do, particularly because it worked so well. And that was a great achievement. But Kemp brought all these people together. Amazing. That's what a leader does. That's what a dynamic official does. And Kemp could be, geez, I know as a reporter, and I wrote a lot of stories about him, he could be difficult to deal with. And Al, you know that. Even though you were trying to write a story that was going to be favorable to him, he'd still be difficult to deal with. But he was a terrific guy, and I think we capture. Mort was in this before I was doing this great oral history. Before I was involved in the book, was so great. All I had to do was read 100 transcripts. I didn't have to go out and interview all these people. But I think we capture them, and that's why I think the book is of great value. Young people, a lot of them, have not heard of Jack Kemp, and we hope through our book they will.
Yeah, what we were hoping is that the 2016 presidential candidates would read the book and have an epiphany, right? This is the way to go, right? This is, you could be joyous, you could be positive, you could not say nasty things about your opponents. You know, Jack Kemp was the absolute antithesis of Donald Trump in every way except high energy. You know, he never disparaged an opponent to his detriment often. I mean, in the 1996 vice presidential debate, he was almost required to expose or to comment about the ethical, not personal, but ethical, political ethical problems of the Clinton administration. And the first question out of the box in the vice presidential debate was, what about Clinton's ethics? And he said, Bob Dole and I are above negative campaigning. We regard our opponents as our adversaries, not our enemies. And everybody who was in the spin room or the pre-spin room from the Kemp entourage wilted at that point. And various people, including Scott Reed, who was Dole's campaign manager, and Bill Bennett, and Ed Fulner, who was Kemp's body man during the campaign. They all say it was the worst night of their lives. Was their political life. So I mean, Kemp was just incapable of negative campaigning. What we need now is somebody with vision, with energy, with ideas, and I don't see that person around. Should we answer questions? What should we do? Yeah.
Well, we can respond to questions.
Yeah.
Answer them, that's another.
If you just identify yourself when you
Mm-hmm. There's one in the back.
So one of the major presidential contenders came out recently and suggested breaking up the big banks. I think that happened today. How do you think Jack Kemp would have responded to that?
That's a good question.
That is a very good question.
I'm not sure. I'm not against it, but some things are unknowable, particularly when you're asking about somebody who died in 2009. I'm trying to think of what issue came up like that in Kemp's career.
I forget what. I know that when the crash was coming in 2008, he and Henry Cisneros, who was his successor at HUD, were on a TV show, and they sort of poo-pooed this as a correction, but I don't know what position he take on
but
TARP.
Kemp was for the bailout. He was for TARP.
Yes, he was for TARP.
He was for TARP, and Neil Cavuto showed us this on Fox. Showed us this tape of his arguing with Kemp and saying, "No, we can't. You don't want to bail out a bailout in this situation. It'll become a precedent. It'll become the practice. It'll be emulated for years to come." And you said and argued with Kemp that you need to let the free market work, that it will solve this problem. And
that was the Cavuto position.
Yeah, that was the Cavuto position.
But
and Kemp disagreed with it.
Yeah.
He was for TARP.
So we don't know the answer. But he was a populist. When David Stockman, who was budget director under Reagan, wanted to raise taxes on beer and cigarettes, Kemp and Trent Lott wrote a letter to David and said, what are you doing taxing poor people when you're retaining all these benefits for Boeing and Gulf Oil and Exxon? So he did have a sense that you should not roll over for huge interests when you're punishing the little guy. So I think that if he thought that the big banks were a menace, and I think there's an argument that they are, that he would have been in favor of breaking them up, but I don't know. Anyway, go. I'm sorry. Next question.
Hi, Grover. I share your view of Kemp being seminal in changing the direction of the modern Republican Party, including Reagan and the way Reagan governed for 8 years. I do have a question, because there were two issues where Kemp was not where the modern conservative movement is now, and was actually hostile when they were brought up. One was school choice, and the other was personalization of Social Security. Do you deal with those two issues and his transfer?
He was
What
for
was the
school
second one?
choice.
Personalization of Social Security.
He was for both of those. He said that vouchers, school vouchers, were enterprise zones for kids, and he was in favor of the private savings accounts for Social Security when Bush 43 proposed them, and
I'm
I
going
think-
10 years earlier, when he was rather rough in opposition to those two when people would bring ideas forward. Later, he did switch on them, but I just thought that's not something you'd look at?
Look, Bill Bennett was the great advocate of school choice when they were at Empower America. Bennett describes Kemp as an economic determinist, a good Marxist. He thought that everything, that if you had economic growth, that everything would take care of itself, and that you didn't need cultural change or anything like that. But Bennett, I think, convinced him to be in favor of school choice, and he was always against cutting benefits, Medicare and Social Security benefits, because he thought that hurt the little guy. But what he would say now, when we've got this debt burden which inhibits growth, I don't know. But my guess is that he would say that you probably had to shave benefits, entitlement benefits, but that you should eliminate at the same time farm subsidies, ethanol requirements, and all these other special breaks that big interests have built into the system that lobbyists have bought in Congress.
I'm Terry Scanlon, Capital Research Center. Had a question about enterprise zones, which you just mentioned. Why didn't they really take off? They didn't cost a whole lot of money. The few that did take off did a lot of good. Do you have any insight on that?
George H.W. Bush didn't care about urban policy at all. And Dick Darman, who was his budget director, didn't like anything that Kemp did. And actually, OMB kept scoring enterprise zones as a big revenue loser, even though these areas were not producing any revenue to lose, right? And but somehow the OMB green eye shade people scored it differently, and part of it was that Darman figured that the Democratic Congress would take any urban policy that was proposed by the administration, pocket it, and then increase spending beyond that. So, but Kemp, the most hostile thing I ever saw Kemp say about anybody, he said about Dick Darman. It's in the book.
There's really, to be, I think you have to concede that there's another reason why enterprise zones didn't do very well, and they turned out to be not enough of a lure for companies to come in these rough areas and invest and build factories and do things. They turned out to be not as good an idea as they seemed they would be, I think.
But Fred, they were never tried. Enterprise zones were never implemented. They got bastardized.
Well, they were tried some places and states.
They got bastardized into empowerment zones, which are tax credits. There was never a true enterprise zone.
What would be a true enterprise zone?
Zeroing out the capital gains tax
Yeah.
in a formerly redlined area.
Yeah.
But Clinton took the issue called
Yeah,
them
no, I
untitled
remember
zones,
that, yeah.
And that's when they got put into
Yeah, well,
place.
some states did enterprise zones, which wouldn't have been as attractive, but.
Actually, Bruce Bartlett, Kemp aide, did an exhaustive study of all the academic studies that have ever been done about enterprise zones, and came to the conclusion that you could not draw a conclusion about it, because some of the studies said that they worked, and some of the studies said that they didn't work. And he said he threw up his hands. It's a very long piece, which I've read actually, and but I know the conclusion. So they've never really been tried.
Not as
And Rand Paul at one stage was saying, well, let's make Detroit, an enterprise zone. It seems to me you couldn't do any worse in Detroit than the current situation.
Just a comment about, how you doing, sir? About enterprise zones, to put it in perspective. Václav Klaus, free market champion, president of Czech Republic, was asked, what about enterprise zones? And he said, more or less, quote, the day we have enterprise zones is the day I resign, because he said the whole country must be an enterprise zone.
Good point. I remember that.
Baron Soga, Tech Freedom. So I'm about a third of the way into the book, and I'm really, really enjoying it. I was 16 when I watched the vice presidential debate back in '96, and while Kemp's people might have thought it was a terrible night, and when I look back on it now, I can sort of understand why. At the time, I was electrified. I couldn't have been more excited, and I just couldn't understand why we hadn't nominated him at the top of the ticket instead of Bob Dole. So I'm really excited to read your book. The thing I'm really most looking forward to, though, is the Social Security story. And I don't, just looking on the Kindle version, I don't see it in there, but I would have thought that Kemp would have understood that Social Security, as it's structured, is essentially a game of who lives the longest. And if you are a white woman in this country, for example, you tend to do very well from Social Security. And if you're a black man, you tend to get nothing because your life expectancy is less than the retirement age. So I would have thought that Kemp would have seen that and would have, for example, pushed Bush to say that the reason we should create private retirement accounts isn't for white people in the suburbs who live long enough to benefit from Social Security, but because of X, Y, and Z particular people who died before they could get any of the benefits. And then, to the point about enterprise zones, that left their communities without a source of capital, because you had working class people who worked very hard their entire lives who ended up getting nothing and having nothing to leave to their heirs, and really paying for the retirement of white people in the suburbs. So why didn't Kemp tell that story? And what would a more Kempian approach to reclaiming social justice from the left and putting it in free market terms, what would it look like today on Social Security or on other issues?
Well,
Go ahead, Mort.
you make a very good point, but you want to read the fourth quarter chapter in this book, where it covers the period of the George W. Bush administration's effort to put through private savings accounts, and Kemp was definitely for them, but it was kind of complicated because he didn't think that Bush Bush sold it right, and but I never heard that argument, which you think would be a very Kempian argument. So I don't really know the answer to the question about what he would be in favor of now about Social Security. I would guess that he would be in favor of private accounts, but I can't be sure.
Just to be clear, my question isn't really what would he have said or what didn't he say. It's more like, why isn't there that voice? Because that was the Kempian spirit. And you see some of that today. You see it in some of the immigration plans from Bush and Rubio. A lot of Rand Paul's positions on especially reaching out to minorities are very Kempian. You hear it a lot in John Kasich's optimism and his focus on economic growth instead of very divisive, pointless social war issues. But it seems like Republicans still just can't get it together to focus on that. And it seems like if Kemp had lived longer, if he'd been more effective.
The problem isn't that they won't focus on it. Republicans don't want to do it. It's a hard issue. You get accused of cutting Social Security, no matter, even if you're not cutting it, just reforming it. I mean, Democrats don't want to do it, and most Republicans don't want to do it. I don't think you could name, I think you could name on one hand the number of Republicans in Congress who endorsed George W. Bush's proposal to reform Social Security and have individual accounts.
Well,
They just weren't there.
well, you could probably name them on two hands, but
Well.
but it certainly failed, and Bush had an all-Republican Congress, and it failed because AARP and allied organizations, the unions, were against it and scared. You know, it was the third rail. So I don't see. Well, wait a minute. Now isn't Chris Christie in favor of what means testing, right?
Very much so.
Yeah. So there's a reform.
Jim Lucier, Capital Alpha. Jack Kemp was never Ways and Means Committee chairman. I
No,
remember
Never
that he
on
was-
Ways
yeah.
and Means.
Well, that's the question I was asking. He was Republican conference chairman, but
That was
I've
later.
got
That
no
was-
idea what other committees he was on, what sort of leadership positions he had beside that.
He was on budget. He was the defense budget expert, actually, and I think that was his main committee.
Yeah.
He wasn't. Yeah, and he was on appropriations. That's right. He was on foreign ops. He was the
Right.
ranking member on foreign ops appropriations committee, which is
right.
makes this all the more remarkable that he was the most important tax writer of his era, even though he was not on Ways and Means. And believe me, it took enormous effort for him to get this thing through.
See,
the
that
Bulls.
was actually my question is,
Yeah.
what's the Kemp playbook today? I mean, if you're not on Ways and Means Committee, do you just need to be a force of nature with inexhaustible energy? Or were there tactics that younger members of Congress today could use to emulate
I think you have to be
Kemp?
Paul Ryan.
Yeah.
And you have to go across the aisle and get together with Orrin Hatch and get together with Ron Wyden, who is amenable
Very
to such
constructive.
things.
Yeah.
He is, yes, he is, on a bipartisan basis.
Absolutely.
And come up with a tax reform
No, the
plan.
first
And
thing-
I don't know why they haven't done it.
The first thing you have to be is not a member of the Ways and Means Committee. That would have dragged him down. You think he would have been able to continue on with this effort for this really revolutionary tax cut if he had to get it through the Ways and Means Committee and that's where he was working on it? Jeez, that would
Not
have
in
killed
those
me.
days, but
That
if you're
wouldn't have
Paul
happened.
Ryan, you're chairman.
Look, Kemp was always looking for converts, and he got some, but they were mainly Republicans. And look, Kemp's effort was, I compare him somewhat with Ted Cruz. Now, Ted Cruz is sort of he acts like at least a revolutionary figure, a Kemp-like figure in the Senate, except he spends all his time attacking the leadership. Kemp never did that. He was focused on his one great idea and pushed it, was looking for acolytes. He found them among a lot of the younger Republicans, eventually older Republicans. Bill Brock endorsed it when he was chairman of the Republican National Committee in 1978 and so on. And Kemp, the great thing about him was he was relentless. He never gave up. He just plowed ahead. He really believed in it. And along the way, he got an awful lot of converts. But it was only going outside the normal procedure in the Republican Party or in any party in Congress. If he hadn't done that, I hate to think of what would have happened to supply-side economics.
One addition to that.
Yeah.
One difference between then and now is it was easier to get this idea to the floor for votes and to build up a track record and a vote history. Today, the procedures are so shut down, you almost need to be a Paul Ryan inside the relevant committee. It's a lot harder now to be an outsider trying to get ideas on the table.
And if you're Paul Ryan, you've got the perch, you've got the ideas, you've got the power, and you can get it done. I mean, why they haven't done it yet? I mean, this is one of the things that when what Kevin McCarthy should have answered is what they have gotten done. Besides the Benghazi hearings to bring down Hillary's poll ratings. I mean, there ought to be a list. There ought to be a list of things that this Republican Congress has at least delivered to Obama to sign or veto, like whatever the substitute for Obamacare is. Where is it? I don't see it. There ought to be a highway bill. They haven't passed a highway bill. These guys, the current gang, they've got control of both houses of Congress, and they have done very little that you could call constructive. All they do is fight, and they're fighting right now. And they basically decapitated their speaker. That's all they do. And you can't blame the Democrats for that.
You can blame the Senate Democratic leadership to some extent, Mort, but we don't need to get into that argument.
I don't like Harry Reid either.
No, I mean, come on. But perhaps you've already covered this. Why was Jack so defensive about the record of the Republican Party on civil rights, particularly in that '96 debate? People like Bruce Bartlett and Michael Zach here have argued, quite persuasively that of the two parties, and if you take their whole existence, certainly the Republican Party has the stronger record on that issue. Jack seemed totally unaware of that. I assume that he did not take debate prep very seriously, or did not take direction in debate prep.
Now Fred is going to. I know what Fred's answer to this question is.
I won't have to give it.
Yeah, you won't. You won't have to. That it was that in the 50s and 60s, it was the Republicans in the Congress who were in favor of civil rights legislation, and it was the Southern Democrats who resisted it. Well, the Northern Democrats were in favor of it, and the Northern Republicans were in favor of civil rights. But what came to happen over time is that those Southern Democrats, like Trent Lott, converted into Republicans. Strom Thurmond, Dixiecrat, became a Republican, and the party, the center of gravity of the Republican Party moved south, and the mentality of the current day, and this is what Kemp thought, of the current day Republican Party was hostile to blacks. I mean, that's what he thought. That's why he was defensive.
Well, what civil rights have these Southern Republicans opposed?
Voting rights, Voting Rights
please.
Act. Now, wait a minute. And every
They're the ones who enacted the Voting Rights Act in the first place.
every social program that Kemp was in favor of would be in danger in a Republican Congress. And look at immigration. I mean, immigration is the current civil rights issue parallel. And what do Southern Democrats, the Sessions brothers, and so on, do about immigration? They don't even want to let legal immigration immigrants in. So I think that's the parallel, and that's what he was afraid of was happening in the Republican Party.
What he did oppose was Nixon's Southern strategy. And you can argue whether there really was one or not, but that's what really he was concerned about, and thought was completely wrong. I don't think he knew that.
Hi. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about Kemp's legacy as HUD secretary, especially when it comes to kind of public housing tenant empowerment programs. So Kimmy Gray, the Kenilworth Parkside stuff. So I actually worked in Kenilworth Parkside recently, which is now a promise neighborhood. So it's gone from, in the 80s and 90s, the idea, right, of residents of public housing actually taking ownership and taking control to improve their lives. Now it's a promised neighborhood where all these like experts and service providers come and try to make lives better, and it's not going very well. And then also choice neighborhoods, which are really focusing on mixed income communities. So I guess I'm kind of wondering, like, what happened with all that, and how did Kemp feel about what happened with all that? I know he didn't get the funding that he wanted and things, but if you could just talk about that.
Kemp at HUD is a Mort specialty.
I mean, look, Kemp reformed HUD, but practically everything else that he proposed was defeated, either by the OMB at the White House or by Barbara Mikulski in the Appropriations Committee, who were both hostile to any such idea. And look, this was a transfer from Britain. It was Stuart Butler and others at the Heritage Foundation who took the Margaret Thatcher example of privatizing council houses in Britain and tried to convert it in the United States. The difference is that the council houses in Britain were basically lower middle class working people who lived in those council houses, and they could afford their apartments. Almost by definition, people who live in public housing in the United States are below the poverty line or at the poverty line and don't have the money to buy their houses. So this tenant ownership thing never really worked, and I think there were, I forget, like 34 units got sold during the entire Kemp era at HUD. It didn't work, and it probably couldn't work. Now, what could work is housing vouchers, which would enable people to go out in the private market and, find housing that wasn't in public housing. But that never went anywhere either.
The HUD chapter, when you think of, HUD, you don't think of, boy, this is going to be fun to read. And the surprising thing about the HUD chapter is you will learn more about Kemp than you didn't know, in that chapter. I did. Mort wrote it, obviously. I learned more about Kemp that I didn't know in that chapter than any other chapter. Of course, I knew a lot about Kemp than the other things, but the HUD chapter is really revealing, and particularly the absolute tension between the Bush White House, the first Bush, and Kemp and HUD, but all the things that Kemp tried and was not able to implement.
I have to go to a dinner. Somehow I got double booked for tonight. Fred can hold the fort for hours, right?
But I don't intend to.
So thanks so much. Join me, guys. I really appreciate it.
So do you want time for a couple more questions?
All right.
Okay, we'll enlist him. So let's see. We have Peter Hong. And we'll go right here. And then we'll go back to John Graham in the back. You're next. John, I'm sorry, John, yeah.
A couple.
Peter Hong. Favorite Kemp story that's not in the book?
That's a good question. I think we got, we tried to make the book very readable, so we emphasized the Kemp stories.
How about that is in the book?
The what?
The one that is in the book.
Well, I already told you that one. My favorite one is the one at the 1980 convention. It just, as I say, I love Tommy Evans. For really, saying no not only to Mike Deaver, but to Henry Kissinger in one great decision. Just a great story. I can think of lots of them in there, but once you read it, you'll find them. Kemp, they're great football stories. Some of the great stories are Kemp joining with black football players in their truly outrage about how they were treated by owners of football teams when they would be, they'd go to a southern city, say Houston at the time, to play.
New Orleans, right?
Well, New Orleans too, but Houston was a big problem. But well, I thought there was also a problem in Houston too. But anyway, New Orleans, Jimmy Kemp reminds me. You go and the football players were segregated. The black players went one place, and which was obviously not as nice as where the white players went. But then there was also in Texas, Jimmy, you'll remember, I forget, outside Dallas, I forget the game was, and the black players were put up in a college dorm, and the white players were put up in a hotel. Well, Kemp objected to all that and objected to the segregation of white players only having white roommates and black players having black roommates, and basically forced, at least at the Buffalo Bills, to integrate the roommates. So a lot of that is really inspiring.
John Burlaw, Competitive Enterprise Institute. Thanks so much, and I look forward to reading your book. Wanted to ask, it seems to me Kemp would, one of his main points was always about the entrepreneur, the entrepreneur achieving the American dream. I seem to remember him talking about that, but I wondered if you all had quantified it. And I'm particularly interested in it because there has been a couple misleading articles around about, the shape of conservatism that said Reagan never used the term entrepreneur, but it was like giving a time frame of 1979 to 1981. And I actually debunked this in National Review that said after 1981, when the term came into currency, he used the term about 200 times in his speeches. But since Kemp's political career really extended into the 90s, how often would he talk about the entrepreneur and the American dream, which a vision which people watching shows like Zark Take It, even the Trump phenomenon itself, seems like a very sellable political thing that you could have public policy proposals around, like with making crowdfunding easier and getting rid of the SEC red tape.
I don't know how often he used the word. He used it some. His father was a small entrepreneur who had business that he started and failed, and then finally his father and his uncle put together a very small trucking company. This was in Los Angeles back in the 30s and 40s. And that's who he really revered, the small entrepreneurs, who he thought would, like large businesses and large investors as well, would be prompted to invest and start companies and innovate and hire and do all the things. But he had a particularly warm spot in his heart for entrepreneurs. Entrepreneurs, who used the word a lot, I think, to his detriment? It was Mitt Romney in his campaign. A lot of voters out there don't want to be entrepreneurs. They just want to have jobs and get a salary. They're not looking for incentives to invest. I was sympathetic to what Romney was talking about, but I think a lot of people weren't.
They want the opportunity. That's what
Yeah, I know, but they're not intending to be entrepreneurs themselves. And I'm not sure many of them all of them even understood the word. And I think the better words to use.
Last question, speaking of immigrants, John Grant.
I think I will yield if someone else has a question. I think my question was answered. Thank you.
How about one last question? Then we'll proceed to the...
Scott Walter, Capital Research Center. Your subtitle's Bleeding Heart Conservatives, so I thought I'd ask you to say something about Kemp's legacy in outside of tax policy or HUD policy, but in real civic society charity and its ability to help people where perhaps government policies can't.
All I can say is he was certainly in favor of that and recognized that was a huge part of helping poor people and so on. But Kemp very much thought that was not enough, that government really had a role. I think Moore touched on part of it, that Kemp came to the conclusion that, particularly when he was at HUD, that while he often repeated the famous line by John F. Kennedy, that a rising tide lifts all boats, that he came to think that there were a good number of boats that were stuck at the bottom and people needed help to get off the bottom, and that help would probably have to come from the government.
Okay, on that note, please join me in thanking Fred Barnes for his time.